Hello everyone and welcome back to Click Theory 2.0. Today's video is pretty exciting where we're going to dive into metric modulation. Now, the concept of metric modulation can seem a little daunting. Playing off of the pulse to imply either rhythmic displacement or another time signature or pulse completely. And there are many great drummers, both past and present, that have used metric modulation in unique and creative ways, whether it's a soloing device or in their timekeeping, or simply to provide rhythmic interest in the music. Now, the questions that I always get with metric modulation, because I like to use it as a device in my playing, is how do you keep track of beat one? How do you get into it, but then how do you get out of it without throwing off of your bandmates? So today's video is going to look at how we can practice this idea of metric modulation methodically so that we can incorporate it musically into any situation. One form of metric modulation is beat displacement, which we've already looked at in numerous forms throughout click theory. In fact, the basic metronome settings themselves are based upon the idea of displacement because the pulse remains the same and you're moving it to other parts of the beat. In the last video, we looked at taking the advanced metronome settings, playing it in a melodic voice, and then displacing that forward in the subdivision. So in many ways, we're already familiar with this concept. In all of those cases, that was one element against a pattern of multiple elements. Now, if we were to truly displace something, everything would need to move against the pulse, giving the illusion that the pattern's been moved to a different part of the beat or there's been a hiccup in the pulse. This can be a really effective tool to create rhythmic tension in a musical context. One great example of this is the drummer Vinny Colaiuta on his self-titled album, and the tune is called I'm Tweaked, where he takes one very simple groove and displaces it numerous times throughout the pulse. It's really hard to keep track of, but he's actually playing in 4/4, but it just displaces so much it sounds like he's playing in all of these different crazy odd meters. It's really cool, you should check it out. So to practice this idea, we can go back to the basic metronome settings since they naturally displace the pulse and work on displacing an entire groove within this particular rhythmic framework. So let's take a very, very simple straight eighth note groove like this one. So from here on out, we can define the challenge of each exercise by what musical material we choose to present. And the simpler we can make our initial exercise, the easier it will be to apply this concept versus trying to execute the groove on its own. So let's take the basic metronome settings, except number one, of course, because it's on the downbeat, and align this simple groove with where the metronome falls within the subdivision. Now, metronome setting number 3, for example, will displace the pulse forward 1/16th note to the E. So we'll also displace the groove forward 1/16th note as well. So hopefully by now, in practicing the previous exercises, you should be really comfortable feeling the downbeat while the metronome is on another part of the beat. But now it's an entirely different feeling when both what we're playing and the metronome is being displaced. So when we play the groove with each displaced metronome setting, it implies that the downbeat is in a different place, when in fact the pulse in beat 1 is still where it originally was. It's really easy with these exercises to just reset your brain into thinking that the metronome is on the downbeat. So how can we practice this? Well, we can alternate between the groove starting on beat 1 and then the groove starting on our displaced metronome setting. So I'll demonstrate this with the same metronome setting, which is number 3 or on the E. And again, you can find all of these exercises notated in the handout, which you can find in the description below. All right, so that is a pretty tricky exercise, isn't it? Now, remember, this is the same idea as the previous exercises in the click theory system. And if it helps, you can vocalize the downbeat as you're playing to keep track of the pulse. But eventually, you kind of want to wean yourself off of that. Now, you can practice this groove with the different basic metronome settings and other grooves that you wish to apply to it as well. But remember, the more complex the groove, the more challenging it will be to modulate. So the previous exercise looked at beat displacement, and now we're going to get into metric modulation by using the advanced metronome settings as a basis. Now remember, the advanced metronome settings are a cycle of a particular number of notes, and we can use this as our new tempo in two different ways, one called implied modulation and then one called actual modulation. So let's go back to our simple eighth note groove and now play that against an advanced metronome setting. Let's take every third 16th note. So with advanced metronome setting number 2, the pulse is generated by every third 16th note, or if you think about it in another way, a dotted eighth note. So now we'll attempt to make the dotted eighth note our new quarter note. Now, since the common subdivision between our initial pulse and our new pulse is 16th notes, we can imply the modulation by fitting the groove within the context of a 16th note subdivision. Now, this won't be a true modulation as you'll hear. It'll sound more like a shuffle groove. But notice how when we modulate, the snare drum and the bass drum are in unison with the metronome. But I'm still fitting the hi-hat within the subdivision of our initial pulse. Now, like before, we can practice alternating between our initial pulse and our new pulse. And since the advanced metronome settings are cyclic, try to match the number of bars for each groove so that the metronome will land back on beat 1 when you modulate. So in this example, we'll play for 3 measures in our initial pulse, but then we'll play for 4 measures in our modulated pulse. So if all goes well, we'll land back on beat 1. So in order to actually modulate into a new tempo, we now need to divide the hi-hat equally between each note in the pulse given our metronome setting. Now in the handout, which you'll find in the description below, you'll see what it looks like if I notated the modulated groove within the context of our initial pulse. Now, I think you can agree with me. That's really hard to read. So in order to solve this, the solution is to think of the modulated groove as simply dotted eighth notes in our initial pulse while keeping track of where beat 1 is. Everything just kind of fits within the new pulse. Don't really think about where the eighth notes are, just think dotted eighth notes. Now, remember, since you're modulating, you're playing 4 measures in the modulated tempo, but in reality, it's 3 measures in our initial pulse. And you could see that in the handout. So now, we're actually going to modulate. So I'm going to play 3 measures in our initial pulse, and then 4 measures in the modulated pulse, and then go back to the initial pulse. So here's what that sounds like. All right, so let's try something a little different. Throughout the entire click theory system, we've been using the metronome in unique and creative ways, but what if we use the metronome in a more traditional sense? So I'm going to play the same modulation exercise, but instead of having the metronome on the tempo that we're going to modulate to, why don't we keep it on our initial pulse? So it's just going to be playing quarter notes. And I'm going to activate the beat function on my metronome in 4/4 time so that a different sound plays on beat 1 so that I can keep track of where it is. So now we can play 4 measures of each groove. We can play 4 measures in our initial pulse and then 4 measures of the modulated pulse. And since the common denominator between both tempos is the 16th note, I should be able to play 4 or 8 measures in the modulated pulse and then land back on beat 1 in our initial pulse. So if all goes to plan, that's what will happen. It's kind of a complicated math equation, but that's how it works out. So here's what that sounds like. So this has been a lot of information, but I hope it gives you an idea on how to methodically practice this idea of beat displacement and metric modulation. Now, this is a very powerful effect in the music that you may be playing, so please keep in mind that this is to be used sparingly and with caution, especially when you're making music with other people. The way that I like to see it is when you play music in any setting, every decision that you make behind the instrument should have a musical reason behind it. And it's very easy to overdo something like beat displacement and metric modulation. And it's very easy to lose your bandmates as well. So please keep that in mind when you want to use this in a musical setting. So practice these exercises mindfully, have fun with them, and I'll see you in the next video.